said, follow me. Ooh. Strive to make my convictions right.
Welcome to this week's edition of our sermon follow-up video. Glad you're joining us. Hopefully you joined us for the sermon. We're about halfway through our series, Accidental Pharisee. It's been a good series. It's been a challenging one, but good. This week, Pastor Brian was following up, and he preached on the good old days, and it was a very good sermon. It was a difficult passage. It was good. I actually watched it twice. It was good. It was that good, man. I didn't leave, and it was pretty good. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We have a couple of questions we want to follow up with Pastor Brian here. One of the things you talked about, you went through a difficult passage where Jesus is really calling out the Pharisees, and he's kind of laying it out there. And it's one that I had looked at when I was preaching a couple weeks back and thought, man, this would be fun to do, but it'd be difficult. And you handled it great. One of the things you talked about in going through all that, and it kind of goes to the good old days thing, is people have this tendency, and you see it all over the place. I think each one of us has this problem. People have this tendency to hold on to the past, hold on to tradition, and often put tradition ahead of truth. And we see a number of problems with that. Could you kind of explain a little bit the difference there and how they separate, and then some of the pitfalls of focusing too much of our attention, what we do and what we teach on tradition rather than truth?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to look at it. Traditions are a great thing. Let's face it, in the next few months, we're going to be in a holiday season. So you have Thanksgiving traditions, Christmas traditions, and those things are great. We get together with family, and there are certain things we've always done. And there's times where we sit back and we think, why do we keep doing this? Why do we do this every single year? But it becomes part of who we are. And I think the same thing happens in the church where people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, things just start happening. And as they happen, traditions, and we can't get into them because there's multiple traditions through multiple churches. But as they start doing it, it's kind of like, hey, let's just keep doing it that way. It works. And then what it becomes is, rather than truth, and when we speak truth here, we mean the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news. So to us, it says Jesus is at the center of everything we do. He has to be at the center of everything we do. As it says in Acts, his name is the only name under heaven by which men can be saved. So that has to be our focus. And I believe people believe that is their focus when they get into it. But with traditions, people begin to think, you know what? I still love Jesus, but we need to do this way, and whatever that is. And so that begins to take more precedence than the preaching of the gospel. When you look at the Pharisees of tradition and truth, they were teaching the people that, there would one day be a Messiah. And of course, we see, because we have the ability to read back, the Messiah was right before them. But in their minds, they went back to the law and they said, hey, here's the law that we were given. This is what Moses was given. Let's follow it. But we don't want to just follow it. We want to make sure we follow it even better than what most people would follow. We want to be better than that. And so, even though their intentions were good, even though, as we've said multiple times through the series, to be a Pharisee was a great thing in that day, it was like being a doctor almost, they began to say, well, let's add this or let's add that, to the point where the things they did outweighed the message of the law and the whole purpose in talking about that. And so, the danger becomes is when we think what we're doing is better than what God has to offer, and that was his son, Jesus Christ. And I don't believe everyone gets into it saying that's going to be our priority as tradition, but it subtly happens and it sneaks in, and before you know it, all right, well, hey, I'm doing pretty good with this, so let's establish this tradition or that tradition. And so I think the danger would be is that when you believe what you are doing is better than what Jesus Christ has to offer. Because let's face it, none of us have anything that's worthy of God. It's amazing we even stand here and can have this conversation. I mean, I'm honored that Jesus has called me to do what I do, but I'm not worthy of it. Romans is clear, there's nothing good in us. So it doesn't matter how many things we do, how many traditions we establish, how close we follow those things. We need Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ has to be the priority. And we can't let those traditions take precedence over other people having the opportunity to hear about Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and you said traditions in general aren't bad, and that's true. There's a lot of great traditions that kind of, especially the holiday season coming up, that enhance our experience at church and in worship. But it's a double-edged sword, and it could become just we just do this because we've always done it, and
Mhm.
we go through the motions, and you miss out on what God's doing, and it causes all these things. And then we were talking about before. You're talking a little bit about how, when we focus in on traditions and we just end up being all about this is the way we've always done it, you get in a rut and you kind of just go through the motions and all those things. And we definitely have a tendency of doing that. It's easy, right? It's easy to trade the relationship for the list of do's and don'ts, and especially with traditions. Some traditions are fun,
They
and
are.
so you just kind of go into that. But again, yeah, traditions aren't bad, but that's the pitfall.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that, just to add real quick, Kyle, is I think the tradition, sometimes if we're not careful, we begin to stifle growth, especially growth in the next generation. Both you and I working with teens know the teens somehow have a different outlook on some of the older traditions. Not that they want to discard them, but sometimes they feel, and it's kind of looking at the table concept, talking of holidays. I grew up in a family where the adults sat at this table and the kids sat at that table. And that was a tradition and all, but the church treats it the same way. Like adults are going to have their traditions, and then when younger people start thinking different, whether it's worshiping through arts or, using the talents they have, people are like, oh, that's different. One of the things I've prayed ever since I've been in ministry is as I get older, is that whatever the next generation does, if the message is consistent, it's the center of Jesus Christ, who cares how they reach people? Methodology can change, traditions can change. But when we believe that that is dogmatic and we have to do it,
Yeah.
that's where we get ourselves in trouble.
Yeah, that's it right there. That is exactly what it is. Well put. So another thing you talked about, in this passage where Jesus is just calling out the Pharisees, he said the Pharisees were serpents and vipers, and then he talks about them being whitewashed tombs, and they wash the cup on the outside, and you had some great illustrations there. So the question is really, every church is going to have some Pharisees in it, and everybody has some Pharisee in them, ourselves included, and we've been talking about that through this series. So the question is, how do we respond to those who are acting like a Pharisee, those who are maybe either trying to push influence in ways that aren't appropriate, or putting tradition ahead of truth, or putting standards on others that are not from Scripture, and it could be anything. You have too long of hair, so God doesn't love you. Like just things like that are ridiculous. How do we respond to people who are doing that when we're interacting with them, in a loving way that's
Right.
productive?
Yeah. I think the first thing is we have to be careful not to become Pharisees ourselves. And sometimes we flip the script. So we look at people who do tradition like, well, that's Pharisaical, but then we become judgmental and Pharisaical in how we approach them. And I think at the center of everything we do, it has to be love, the love of Jesus Christ. We're called to love all people. That's what the Pharisees missed out on. They're sitting back going, all right, why is this Jesus guy eating with all these people like we talked about Sunday? Why would he want to be with those people? And that's where he says in Luke and also in Mark, I came to seek and save that which was lost, to come and serve everyone, not to be served. Whereas the Pharisees took this approach, no, I'm here to be served. It's about me. And we talked about how they put themselves in places of authority and gave themselves titles. But I think the key is obviously the basis we have to pray for those people. But when we approach them, our goal is not to knock them down. It's not to condemn them. It's not to be judgmental, because that's what a Pharisee does. And that can be difficult from a human standpoint. But we have to love them, and we have to show them in a loving way, hey, here's what you did. Here's what you're doing. Here's how you're stifling someone. Here's how someone is growing distant from you because of how you are reacting to them. The illustrations that Jesus gives it's amazing. As we talked about Sunday, at the start, he's like, hey, they put themselves in the seat of Moses, which was the supreme lawgiver to them, Moses was. And, and it instantly, as we talked about in verse 3, he says, do and observe all they command you, but don't follow them according to their deeds. In other words, if they're leading you the right way, don't follow them. And I think for some Pharisees, that becomes something where they realize, hey, people aren't following me anymore. Why is that? But then as we got to the end of the passage, he gives those illustrations. And my favorite is the one where it talks about, obviously, the serpent and the viper. And because when you understand how the viper was, it was a small poisonous snake that looked like it looked like a twig just laying on the ground until you picked it up, and then it bit you and it hurt you. A Pharisee looks just like everyone else. Back then they wore their long tassels and phylacteries, that were bigger. But today, if we're looking at our church, we know Pharisees exist in the church. They don't look different. They don't dress different. They act different. But for someone who's a Pharisee, they look just like everyone else until they latch on, just like that viper, and they bite in. And the interesting thing was, Jesus using a snake and a viper, as we talked about, that was the equivalent of like the most evil thing you could be. And so he's purposely saying, look, you can't do this. This is complete evil what you're doing. You are misleading people. And he even said, woe to you, because you're keeping people out of the kingdom of God. You pick and choose. So for us, when it comes to Pharisees, we have to show them, hey, here's the truth. It's a gift. You know, I can't sit around and say, well, that person deserves it or that person doesn't, because I don't. You know, and so I think when it comes to dealing with Pharisees, you know, we just have to go in a loving, not a condemning way, and sit down and say, hey, Kyle, you know, here's some things I'm seeing in your life. You know, as a Christian brother, I love you, man, but here's some things I'm seeing, and it's causing other people not to grow or not to want to come to Christ.
He does that every week, by the way.
Yeah. I try doing it on a daily basis to myself, but it's a whole deny yourself thing. But the whole idea is, you know, we have to love people the way Christ did. If our lives don't match Christ, as we said, we're his ambassadors, we're to imitate him, Christ-likeness, then the chances are we're probably acting Pharisaical. You know, it's either, I look at it in thirds. You're either acting like the world and you're completely in it. You're acting Pharisaical where you withdraw from the world and think you're better than everyone else. Or you're really transformed, as it says, and you're trying to follow Jesus Christ and his example and be as much like him as possible. So I think that's where we have to be, is we have to be more like Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's it right there. And you hit like my next two questions right there perfectly. One of the things you said during the sermon, you were talking about, you know, Jesus was getting flack from the Pharisees for hanging out with the sinners, you know, and man, we get that. You know, that still happens today. You know, we're all guilty of that on some level. And the way you put it, I can't remember exactly the way you said it, but you're basically, you know, you kind of played the part of the Pharisee, and you were saying, well, why are you hanging out with them instead of hanging out with me? You know, and us, and we've got it all together, and, you know, we look the part, and we're, you know, doing everything right. And in their mind, they were doing things right.
Right.
And then you brought in that verse, and you said, you know, basically Jesus said, you know, you look like everybody else, but you're poison.
Yeah.
And that viper is poison, and that's what you're talking about, and that's really, there's so much truth to that. You know, the Pharisees, and when we act like a Pharisee, we poison.
Exactly.
We poison what it is we're trying to, it's counterproductive. We poison, you know, the well, so to speak, and you know, we may mean well, we may be trying to, you know, put these things on people that God didn't put on them. And in doing so, it's poisonous, and it destroys relationships. It destroys so many things, and it perverts the truth. It perverts the gospel to add more to it, and that's something I think that, you know, we constantly try to battle even within ourselves. Just
right.
You know, make sure that it's not about position. It's not about how well I've obeyed here and there and this and that. It's the grace and mercy that God has given us, and what Christ has already done on the cross that gives us our standing, you know, before God, and it doesn't matter, you know, anything else outside of that.
Yeah, and I think when you get to be a Pharisee, you know, in the sense of the Pharisee, they were doing the law. They were following exactly what they were supposed to do, just kind of elevating it. But I think, you know, when we become a Pharisee is when we think God deserves us and other people deserve us. To me, as I studied the Pharisees, and I think we've all said this multiple times, this has been a gut-wrenching, spiritual thumping series for me so far. And we're only halfway through it. So by the time we're done, I feel like, you know, Rocky getting out of the ring with Apollo Creed or something. But, you know, it's one of those things where it's made me realize that, and we have these tendencies that we just so subtly slip into, where, you know what, I am a pretty good person. You know, look at everything I'm doing. You know, look at ministry. And, you know, this is nothing of my doing. None of this is Brian. All this is Jesus Christ. But a Pharisee begins to think, you know, I'm better. You know, they deserve what I bring. They deserve who I am. Jesus needs me. He really doesn't. You know, any of us could be stripped away today of what we're doing, and the church will continue. Jesus' name will continue. So I think for Pharisees, that's why it's so subtle, is it looks just like they look just like everyone else. And in a lot of ways, they act like everyone else. But it comes down to the heart's attitude. So.
Yeah, that's a big part of what, you know, Jesus kind of called them out. He said, you know, I know what's in their heart, and that's a scary thought. You know, he knows what's in our heart, and we try to hide it from everybody else and wear these masks. So, good stuff. If you missed the sermon, go check it out. It's posted up on YouTube and on the website and all those things, and also Matthew 22 is what we were looking at. Go through, read that. Just spend some time praying through it and ask God to kind of reveal that, and it was good stuff. So thanks a lot, Pastor Brian, and thanks for joining us.
Have a good week.
Treasures